Okay. Reimagining Beloved Community, Part 1. My message today is, as I hinted earlier, based on this book by Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, A More Perfect Union, A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community. Now, this book came to me, I didn't know anything about it until Lori Robson, she's a member of the Green Bay congregation, brought it to me, just handed me a copy, and she said, here, you need to read this. And it was partly, in Green Bay, there's an interfaith justice organization that the Green Bay Fellowship is a founding member of, and she's our representative. It's called Joshua. And she said that Joshua has chosen this as a spring common read and over the summer. And so I thought, okay, lots of people hand me books. I rarely get to read them, so it kind of just got put aside. And then I ended up being offered the opportunity to do 2 sermons back to back in the Door County Fellowship, the Sunday before July 4th and the Sunday after. And I thought, whoa, this would be really good to take a book that blends politics and religion together and do it there. So that was the nexus or the ground spring for doing this sermon. And I really have enjoyed putting it together. I decided to create a 2-part series, partly because that's what they wanted, but I also wanted to encourage us to have our summer read with this. So today I'm summarizing the first half of the book, chapters 1 through 8, where he makes the case for a new vision for beloved community, as long as he calls it the building blocks for doing so. I would call it the stumbling blocks for doing so. And then next week, I'll be back for the second half of chapters 9 through 15. And he talks about what would the world look like if we had beloved community, and where are the key components of that already being worked on. And then after the service, whenever that is, probably 11:30-ish next Sunday, we're going to have a book group discussion. So if you want to pick it up and read it, or if you already have, come join us. Even if you haven't, you can come and just hear the discussion. So let me talk about the book. Taylor's reason for writing the book was basically outlined in that letter to his sons. That was his thesis, and then he just added to it. The background to that, however, is in the election in 2016, they're a very political family. They work on justice issues, and they had a baby and a young son. And they've been talking about it through the whole thing, and the son actually had to go to bed before the election was finished that night, if you recall. And he came into their bedroom in the middle of the night and wanted to know who had won. And they had to tell him that President Trump, or Trump was now the president, or going to be the president, and he was very confused by that, because obviously comes from a very ethical family, and he couldn't understand why somebody who said the things that they were saying could have won. Well, the father didn't do a very good job of explaining it that night, so then when it got to be 2020 and the outcome was a little sketchy, he had this letter prepared to explain it, and by then the baby was also old enough to hear it. So Taylor believes emphatically that Martin Luther King Jr. had it right when he talked about beloved community over and over again. But to give credit where credit is due, Martin Luther King Jr. did not create the term beloved community. It was created by a philosopher theologian by the name of Josiah Royce. And it was used by the leaders of an organization, a national organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was an interfaith organization founded in 1915. Now, obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't alive back then, but when he was a minister, he became a member of this organization, and that's where he first heard about it, and then he popularized it. Now, the author points out that Martin Luther King Jr. never actually explains what he meant by beloved community. He used the term a lot. He saw it as a vision of total interrelatedness, a solidarity of all humans living at this collective destiny. He uses the Christian Greek term agape love, meaning that everyone is worthy of love. You don't need to earn it. And he famously believed in nonviolence was a key to building such a community, but he never actually unpacked it. So after he died, his widow, Coretta Scott King, wrote that essay as part of a bigger thing to explain it, because there's no sermon or speech to point back to from Martin Luther King Jr. So beloved community, the book. I think the book is really well written. It's an interesting narrative. He comes up with these really important points, and then he's a storyteller. Story after story after story in the book. Many of them are his personal stories. He's very well connected, not just in the United States, but in the world. And I found that really fascinating to see how he interprets this philosophy or ethical choice into his everyday life. However, I started the book when I was on a flight, I think, from Los Angeles coming back home, and I was reading chapters 1 through 7, and I kept nodding to myself like, yep, I get that, yep, And then I realized that if you are at all a progressive or all aware of political history in the last 50 years, or probably a Unitarian Universalist, none of his concepts are new. He does bring up a lot of the things that are tried and true among progressive writers and scholars and politicians. And I've read some reviews of his book, and they said the same thing, and even the folks in Green Bay, when we did our book review a couple weeks ago, said the same thing. So I think he's writing it for people where this is new. Say you're a 20-something that are just kind of becoming an adult in the world and trying to figure out your path and pick this up. He also writes that, of course, he's a Baptist minister. So he does write it often from a Christian perspective and pulls in a lot of Christian references. So I kind of think that's his target audience. As the president of Sojourners, that makes a lot of sense. So 1 through 7, I'm going 1 through 8 today. So hang in there with me if you're like, okay, I already know that. When I got to chapter 8, though, I got really excited, and I'll tell you why when we get to that one. So hang on for that. So let me start. Part 1, there's actually 2 parts. He splits the first half, these 8 chapters, into 2 parts. Part 1 is the vision of beloved community. So in chapter 1, he kind of just slaps you across the face. He says the title is Embracing a Bigger Story of Us. He asks, what is America's shared story? Now, a lot of us of a certain age had a certain story of American history when we grew up, but it didn't include anybody that didn't look like me and my family. And so he says we need this true story that we can all accept. He kind of points out that it's a counter to the Make America Great Again story, which is not so subtle reference to a story of white Christian nationalism from some fantasy period in the past. So he comes with a conclusion of who are we as Americans, that we can absorb all the pain and hardship and tragic suffering of our past and reconcile it to a stronger, more unified vision of ourselves. So chapter 2, he says why America must be reborn. Now, if you got here early, I had Tracy Chapman playing a song called New Beginnings, and she's kind of talking about, it ain't working, we need to just start it over and be reborn through forgiveness and reconciliation, sort of a Christian theology. And that's what he talks about in this chapter. And he reminds us that in American history, every time there was incredible social change, it was either led by religious organizations or they were right in there supporting it every single time. And he thinks that's the kind of energy that this needs, even though religious organizations don't have the same power they once had, they still have a moral voice. He says, our nation's rebirth will require coming to terms with our past and making amends while we embrace a new set of commitments for the future. If we remain steadfast in claiming and living out our best religious and civic ideals, we can and shall overcome. Even though he wants churches, religious organizations, I shouldn't just have Christian, he uses Christian terminology, to be in the forefront of this discussion, he does pull out a Martin Luther King Jr. quote that's a cautionary tale. And once again, he was a Baptist minister too, so he uses a lot of Christian language. The quote is, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. The next chapter is one that I really liked. It's called E Pluribus Unum, out of the many one. So those of you of a certain age probably remember a time when that was our unofficial motto of the United States, and it was on our money until the McCarthy era and the communist scare and those godless Russians. So we had to put "In God We Trust" on our money at that point. And with that, he claims, and I agree, we lost something. Because instead of it focusing on the diversity of this country and how to, out of many, one, and it also gives us a sense of agency, like we are here together as a group, a diverse group of Americans, and we will rise to the occasion as a collective group. It flipped the agency to "In God We Trust." And so it not only made it religious, which we're supposed to be a secular country, but it also seemed to say, you know what, we've got all these problems, we'll just pray for the answer like we do with gun violence and things like that. So it's a fascinating thing to think about in this beloved community context. And just to give credit where credit is due, the quote actually comes from a Roman statesman and philosopher, Cicero. And what he actually meant by it is when each person loves the other as much as himself, it makes one out of many. So it wasn't just a statement, an observation like a statistical observation. There was an intent implied. Taylor goes on to say, our oneness is not found in a single culture, language, or place of origin like Western Europe, but rather in our shared ideals, values, and aspirations, as well as in our commitment to love the other as much as ourselves. Our diversity is our strength. So chapter 4, he goes on to say, reimagining beloved community. His vision, Taylor's vision of beloved community, is to build a nation in which neither punishment nor privilege is attached to one's race, skin color, gender, ethnicity, nationality, or sexual orientation and gender identity. He says living up to these standards would mean that every person, all of whom are made in the image of God, would be equally valued and respected, and that their dignity would be affirmed. The inherent worth and dignity of everyone. Sound familiar? The beloved community cannot be defined only on what shouldn't happen. It should also be defined around a positive vision of a preferred future. And here's where he goes off and talks about this vision. And I really got excited about this. So if you think of American culture, from the very beginning, it's all about being independent, being, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get out there, be that pioneer. It's this mythology that we've had forever. Well, that fierce independence, and if you remember my sermon back in June or May with the generations, every generation finds a new way to express that with more intensity, is part of what's leading to the polarization in our society, because everybody wants to be extreme and nobody wants to kind of compromise and come to the middle. So he's saying instead of a society that's built on independence and striving that way and political division, what if the key word in every document, everything we did, was beloved community? I think of it as like, what if a skywriter had it in the clouds, like, what's the Wizard of Oz thing, Surrender Dorothy? It would be sort of like beloved community would be wherever you looked. And his point would be that it doesn't mean there's an absence of conflict. We would still have differences of opinions, we'd be independent, be able to speak them, but maintaining right relations with each other is the primary thing, that we Americans hang together, we do this together, and we are not going to be forced to be divided. And so every time, it's almost as if there was a big eruption and a conflict, that we'd stop everything back like when the pandemic started. And we'd say, okay, we have to figure this out. We got to get back in right relations before we go back and start it all up again. What if beloved community were that important to our society? He says it would be in the same moral compass as what we read in the stories of the Hebrew prophets. Or he says the early Christian church leaders, and we're talking about before it became the church of the empire, the Christian church of the Roman Empire. Or he says even the ethos of the civil rights leaders in the 20th century. That's what he sees. So that was there's why we should consider beloved community and reimagine it. Then he goes into part 2, the building blocks, or like I said, the stumbling blocks. And the very first chapter, chapter 5, is titled Unmasking America's Myths. And this is a good one. He quotes Richard T. Hughes in an essay called Myths America Lives By. I've heard these before. I've never heard them stated quite like this. And it's, if you think about it, it will become very familiar with what you know if you've grown up in American culture. But it's scary. So myth number 1, the myth of a chosen nation. The notion that God Almighty chose the United States for a special mission in the world. Now there's a footnote here, because if you know anything about the Pilgrims and the Puritans coming over from England and creating Boston, they were going to do this shining beacon on a hill, that this was going to be the model city to show the world that America was going to do it a different way. So those are our religious ancestors if you go back about 400 years. And so our hands are a little dirty in this. But the myth of a chosen nation leads to myth number 2. The myth of nature's nation. The conviction that American ideals and institutions are rooted in the natural order, that is, in God's own intentions first revealed at the dawn of civilization. Think about that. Number 3, coming out of those two, the myth of the millennial nation. That notion that the United States, building on that natural order, will usher in a final golden age for all humankind. I know, I'm looking at people rolling their eyes and kind of like, oh, brother. I met with my financial advisor a couple of weeks ago, who's very smart and very connected, of course. He grew up in Wausau, and we were talking about this, not this specifically, but what's going on. And it was before the changes in the election, so everything was doom and gloom from my perspective at the time. And he said, yeah, I have 2 brothers that we were raised in the same house, and they believe absolutely this, that that's what's coming now and that's what we're headed for. And he goes, it's very frightening. Myth number 4, the myth of a Christian nation. This one I think we all hear about in the time in the press. The claim that America is a Christian nation consistently guided by Christian values. And then number 5 is a doozy, and this is the manifest destiny in my mind, the myth of the innocent nation. The conviction that the nobility of the American cause always redeems the nation and renders it innocent. Whatever we do, it's meant to be. So that's chapter 5. Chapter 6. This one's kind of obvious. It's telling the whole truth to set us free. He gets back to what is our story. He reiterates that America's founding was grounded in white supremacy, and therefore the dominant narrative is a whitewashed version of our story. And he points out, though, that all attempts at a more truthful narrative have further fueled polarization. You've seen this. Anytime anybody says, well, wait a minute, they're basically beat up verbally and on the internet, and then sometimes physically, for not being patriotic. Chapter 7 is overcoming toxic polarization. This is one where, example after example, we all know them. We know what's been driving polarization. I won't go through it. He says the only thing the 2 sides can agree on is that it's getting worse. He does suggest something that I'm not sure what I think about it. He talks about, it came from some thought by Rachel Klein, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, that we need to find these places where we still have cross-cutting identities. And by that, he means, are there organizations or ways we come together in this society where both sides of the polarization still interact with each other. And he lists two of them. One is religious organizations, and one is location, tied to location. Religious organizations, I'm not so sure, because these days it seems like all religious organizations are falling into one side or the other of the divide, but maybe there are still some that come to just be in that larger community. The ties to a location, though, makes sense to me, because I sense that here. There is Fond du Lac, right? And even though there's a political divide here that's very clear, you're still part of Fond du Lac, and you get along one way or another. And so that's what he's saying. Find those places, and maybe that's where you begin. Again, he gives a caution, again, about the Christian church, that he's not talking about Christian nationalism and the Christianity that's pushing that. Those are not the organizations. Religion should focus on values, he says, not politics. And then finally, chapter 8. Chapter 8 I liked a lot. It talks about nationalism not being patriotism. And he takes a quote from Charles de Gaulle. It's this: patriotism is when love of your own people comes first. Nationalism is when hate for people other than your own comes first. So patriotism is when love of your own people come first. Nationalism is when hate for people other than your own comes first. And then he goes on to say healthy patriotism, love for the ideals of one's country with an ongoing commitment to realize them fully. That's the definition of healthy patriotism. Equal justice under the law. Commitment to liberty and justice for all. Redemptive patriotism is claiming these values and freely proclaiming when we miss the mark, without having fear of retribution. In fact, redemptive patriotism is standing up for those who do proclaim that we've missed the mark and can do better. So my key takeaway from all these 8 chapters, and particularly this one, is that Unitarian Universalists, I think, need to redeem patriotism and be more overt about it. I believe everything he said perfectly applies to our Unitarian Universalist faith. We are a value-driven faith. Our values are absolutely in alignment with the goals of beloved community. And we frankly need to stop letting the MAGA folks have a monopoly on what is perceived as American patriotism, but really a poorly disguised Christian nationalism. And I think of simple symbols. Little story about my upbringing. We were kind of working poor. My parents were centrists, but my mother was a Democrat, very much had been rescued by Roosevelt's programs out of the Great Depression. And my father was a centrist Republican, just didn't want to spend a lot of money, but was pretty good with social issues, right? So that's how I grew up, in a house like that, where they freely talked about it and laughed every time they went to vote. They canceled each other out, and that was okay by them. And so we grew up very patriotic. We always flew the flag. In fact, when we finally moved to our last house in Rockford, we had a flagpole that was in the ground out front, and it was my job to put up the flag every morning. And then back then, you didn't leave them up at night, so I had to take it down every night. And of course, picture this, we had the red, white, and purple petunias planted around the flagpole. So I was very, very, very proud of that, and never thought of that as any kind of political statement at all, other than a patriotism, a proud patriotism for our country. Also, I have to remind you, I grew up during the bicentennial, so we were a little bit over the top, even painted the fire hydrant in our yard, red, white, and blue. But nonetheless, I have a new house in Appleton. Appleton has the largest Flag Day parade in the country. It's a big deal. And all of my neighbors fly their flag, and we don't. And I feel weird about that, and I don't know why. And so somebody's pointing at my flag down here. So I said, I'm going to figure out if I can maybe do an American flag and one next to it that just says beloved community. Or I've seen these flags where it looks like they print something over the American flag. So I thought, well, maybe I can go out there and find a vendor that would print beloved community over the American flag. Thank God I found out that that's still illegal. You can't deface the American flag. When you see that, it's actually an image of something and it's not really a flag. So I went out and just tried to look for things. And I found this one that I hope you can see on the camera. There we go. Make Americans kind again. And there's key phrases. And I wanted to order this partly as a prop for my sermon today, but partly to also put in my yard as something that I felt, it's very patriotic looking, but it sends the message I want to send. Now, unfortunately, the people who made this, it was from Etsy, which is, you know, little artsy, crafty, small vendors. English wasn't their first language. And so you'll notice there's a stripe that's missing, and it was so beautiful. And then the last line on there says, about hatred. And I think it was supposed to say abolish hatred. And I'm like, I can't put this out on my yard. So it's just going to be used for these sermons, and that's it. But that's the idea to me of a way to say, hey, I'm just as patriotic, but to me it means kindness and not divisiveness. So that's just my little prop for today. So I want to leave you with a final excerpt from the book. It's basically an inspirational call to take up the challenge of beloved community. Now, a caveat. He uses the word America over and over and over again. And I want to acknowledge that America is actually North and South America. It's a big part of the world with a lot of different peoples here. So he's obviously referring to United States of America, but that's a little mouthful, so he uses just America. I want to acknowledge that. America, where at our best we have defended human rights and sowed seeds of democracy around the world, even if at times done unevenly or counterproductively. America, I love your multiculturalism and diversity, where you can see almost the entire world reflected in so many of our cities. America, I love that you have provided refuge and solace for some of the world's most persecuted and oppressed people, even if this commitment has been halting at times. America, I love the genius of your entrepreneurship and inventiveness, the scholarship and excellence of American higher learning. America, I love the beauty and breadth of your landscapes. America, I love the music and art forms you have invented, the brilliance of jazz, hip-hop, rock and roll. America, I love your pioneering democratic system of checks and balances, divided government, and constitutional rights. And despite your major setbacks, I love your onward march towards forming a more perfect union and becoming a more inclusive and just democracy. These are just some of the reasons to preserve this country, to celebrate it, and to strengthen it. End of quote. And I would add, may we someday just as proudly declare America, the beloved community. May it be so. Let's take a moment of silence.